Okay, good day to everybody. Welcome to all of you from wherever you are from. And today I'm going to look at the issues around power and control of organizations. And before I do that, I'm going to introduce you to a little case study story that is focused on London's police. A little short story. And it all starts on the 29th of September in 1829, when Sir John Peel introduced the first police organisation in the UK in a formal sense, and it was in London. And there was a lot of opposition against its introduction, both from the public at large, who felt that their whole way of life would be constrained, and also the politicians, who were very suspicious of the political agenda behind bringing in such an organization into London. And so the foundation of the whole introduction of the police force was based on consent, policing by consent. So John Peel was a very clever guy who realized that this was going to be one of the main underpinning ways of operating so that they could maintain the consent of the public. And in doing so, it was about reasonableness and appropriateness. And so those who were becoming police officers needed to find this link between their statutory powers and the way they operated through this concept of what was reasonable and appropriate given the situation. And that appropriateness and reasonableness would vary significantly depending on where people were being policed. And this whole concept has stood the test of time from the very, very beginning. And if we sort of move forward to the 1960s, it was still an era of policing by consent. And in deciding what was reasonable, you could walk down one street in London. On one side, there would be the population who were quite poor, and living in very tight accommodation. And yet just across the road were the landed gentry with all their money and their very large houses. And a constable who was working in this area would have to make decisions based on what was reasonable to both sets of population. And so if there was a fight and someone was severely injured, if they were on the public side, the normal day-to-day working public, then the officer would give first aid and get them to talk to each other and agree with each other, and they would go on their merry way. But if the same thing happened on the other side of the road where the landed gentry were living, then it would be treated like attempted murder, because they would see it as not being reasonable for it to be treated otherwise. And so there's this fine line between what was reasonable in the circumstances and what the law required. And within this decision-making process, there was a bit of a paradox, because the police officers, when they were inside their police station, were totally controlled. When they came into their police station, there was a book called Book 92, and they had to sign in and show why they were going into the police station. And this was checked regularly, and they had to sign again when they left the police station. And their superiors would check the times and what they were supposed to be doing in the police station. And if there was any anomaly, or they felt that the police officer spent too much time in the station and not on the streets, then they would be subject to discipline. And there were many other constraints on when they could go into the police station at night. If it was below zero, they may be given some indulgence to go in and warm up. Otherwise, they had to stay on the streets and so forth. So everything in the police station was totally controlled. And yet, when they went out on the streets, then it was all about them and their self-control. And this picture on the right-hand side was taken in 1968 during the hippie period. And the officer concerned had to decide whether it was appropriate to arrest this person, given what was happening and what the demonstration by the hippies was all about, or whether to just give words of advice and let things go. And this was totally in the hands of the police officer, and no one would criticize those decisions. And so this strange situation that they found themselves, that when they were out on their own, they had almost the decision of life and death within the parameters of the law, compared with in the police station, everything was controlled by systems and processes. And then in 1995, there were some major changes in the way that police were controlled in London and subsequently throughout the country in the United Kingdom. Since about 1980, new public management had slowly been introduced into the public sector. But it wasn't until 1995 that it really had a big impact on the police service via performance measurement. So they were bringing in controls via a performance management system. And so we went from local decisions based on community needs and the conditions that were pertaining at the time to a system of government policing objectives and associated performance measures, which took little or no account for any particular community needs. It was a typical sort of political approach that those who shouted the loudest put the pressure, and the different objectives forth came. And so the whole local social contract between police and community changed significantly. And so the police officer decisions changed from the local reasonableness to doing what was measured. And the measurements meant that some things that the police officer would normally not prosecute for were being prosecuted because they were accounted for in the measures, and that went towards their funding, and they had increased funding. And many of these things were very minor things that the public were frustrated about. And so the policing by consent was at risk because of this change. And so on the one hand, on the left, we've got the local decisions based on community needs and conditions. And then on the right-hand side, we have today the government policing objectives and associated performance measures, which are now seen more political than anything to do with natural justice in the community. And so the behavior of individual police officers has changed significantly, and the public response to that has equally changed. And as you can see, just by the uniforms, the need now for tasers, handcuffs, the radios, the cameras, and everything else is indicative of the changed circumstances. And I'm not saying this is cause and effect, because there are other things that came into play. Whereas the constable on the left, all he had was a stick tucked into a pocket in his trousers, which he wasn't even allowed to take out unless he wrote a big report to justify why he had to defend himself. And so the conditions changed completely. And one of the major drivers for this was the change in the performance measures. And this was the subject of my PhD, which I published in 2021, which looked at the impact of new public management on policing in London and how it changed the behavior of not just the organization as a whole, but differently with every individual, depending on where they were working and the needs of that community. And so I leave you with that sort of little case study of the power, if you like, to control behavior through something like performance measures as we go into this discussion today, or this presentation, and hopefully a discussion on the power and control of organizations. I think it's fair to say that most people would agree that traditional hierarchical organizations are designed for control. And when Ross and I were doing all our work, we said, well, what if organizations were actually designed for work as opposed to designed for control? And on the face of it, that seems sensible and yeah, some challenges, but doable. And the more we looked into it, the more we saw others were trying to find alternatives to the traditional hierarchical organizations, and yet most of them weren't going towards the design for work. There were a few exceptions to that, which we've discussed in earlier discussions and papers that we've given. And so we said, well, if we're moving towards an organization designed for work, we need to examine the power and control of organizations. And what we found was that this is seldom thought through in its entirety, which seems quite strange, because if an organization is designed for control, you'd think that a lot of thought would go into what that really means. But it seems that it's not as thought through as one would think. And so if we're designing a new organization, there are many ways that this is done, but whatever way they do it, there is one major driver for the end product, and that's shareholder value. So whatever design we're going to come up with in the traditional mindset is we're aiming for increased or at least maintaining shareholder value. And so we will look through that lens. And traditionally, that lens has been about making sure we retain control of the organization and push it in the direction of shareholder value. And so whatever happens, I don't know what happened there. We're going to make sure that we are able to guard the whole control system, whatever changes we make in our organization. And so what I'm going to do now is go through the different types of control, how we maintain our power and control, look at how the workforce controls an organization, and I'm going to introduce perhaps a new term for most people, and that's coalition power. It's something that Ross and I have been discussing, and we're not 100% there yet, but I'm raising it today so that hopefully we can discuss it after this presentation. We'll look at the three main processes of organizations and the management system. We'll look at work, behavior, and organization learning processes. Believe it or not, they are very much about control in organizations. The role of performance management, and at the end, an alternative approach through the lens of Futocracy, not going into it as an organizational concept that's been done many times by us in many presentations and papers, but particularly in relation to power and control. So what is power? Well, power is the ability to influence the behavior of others to get what you want. And good old Angela Merkel here was very good at that. If we look at it from an academic definition, power is simply the ability to get things done the way one wants them to be done. So it's a similar theme, just the words are slightly different, but the outcome is very, very similar. Now, power can have positive and negative consequences. We can align an entire organization to move together and achieve goals. And that's crucial for the success of organizations. But at the same time, autocracy can destroy companies and countries alike. And we've had many, many examples of that documented over the years. And of course, there's this wonderful saying that power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And in hierarchical organizations of the traditional construct, there are many, many examples of this becoming a reality. And many of the court cases that have followed demonstrate this. I'm going to use some very commonly used terms in terms of looking at positional power and personal power. On the positional power, we have legitimate power, and this is based on your role in the organization. It's inherent within the role that you have, whether it's the CEO, the CFO, head of marketing. The organization as a whole entrusts within you the power of authority by virtue of your role. And there are some constraints within that power, both from a legal point of view, but also from a common sense point of view. But basically, it is about your role. It's the same with reward power. This is linked to your position in the organization. and to some degree or other, you're able to reward people, or in the coercive power, punish people, which may be taking away a reward or failing to give a reward, kicking someone out the organization, whatever is the negative side of the situation. And resource power is an interesting one for me, because this is very much historically a positional power, and it was typically invested in senior management and through their HR processes. And that seems to be sort of devolved more and more. And whilst it's still in positions of management and leadership, it's an area that's changing quite a bit, but it's still at the moment about position. On the personal power side, we have the referent power. Now, in our conversation today, I'm referring to referent power as being how others see you and what they associate with you as a person. So if they like you as a nice, personable person who can have a conversation and listens, the way they see you will reflect this. Or if you're a person who's very antagonistic or narcissistic, then again, this is the referent power that they will see within you. And this is very, very important, as we'll see in a moment. Now, expert power can mean many different things according to the power system approach that you have. In this particular case, I'm splitting it from the next one, which is information power. And the expert power in this case is what you can do and what you're able to teach others. So it's a combination of learned behaviors. It's about the types of knowledge that you have, the practices that you have undertaken over the years and developed. So it's not just tacit knowledge, it's a whole range of knowledge and ability that you have. The information power is basically what you know. The connection is the people, your network. And this is a very, very important part, particularly for people who are in entrepreneur type situations. And so the connection power, later you will see that this is probably one of the most powerful things that we have. So we have this positional power, which is about your position, and we have the personal power, which is about you as a person. Now, if we look at a traditional hierarchical organization, it's built on the foundation of legitimate power and resource power. And through those two powers, the hierarchy should be able to run an effective organization, because they're basically controlling what people do and the rewards and so forth. But actually, it's never enough. And over the years, it was found that they had to have some other way of motivating people to do what they wanted them to do. And so we started to bring in reward power and coercive power. So if you did what you were expected, you gained an appropriate reward, which could be basic, like employment, or it could be some extra remuneration or some other benefit. And if you didn't, then there were punishments. And then around about 1984, I think it was, the whole idea of strategic human resource management came into being, with the idea that if we link people's behavior with the strategy of the organization and bring the two together, we're going to be very successful, because the organization wants to improve its shareholder value and the people enjoy being part of that process. And so from about 1990 onwards, it became very much in vogue and is still very much the heart of all HR organizations. And so the idea was that we would have motivated people. The irony is that the assumptions behind strategic human resource management actually weren't true. The needs of the organization for its shareholder value was very different to what people look for in the nature of work. And every piece of research that's been done since 1990 has showed a decline in motivation and engagement in organizations. Till today, it's reached a record low into very small numbers of people engaged. And so it wasn't about motivating, it's more about compliance. And if you want to read more of that, if you go on our platform, there's a paper that I have published on strategic human resource management. And not to say that we should not be linking strategy with what people do in organizations. Absolutely not saying that. What it does say is we got the formula wrong. We have got the methodology wrong. And so when we're looking at controlling people, and performance management is one of the main controlling mechanisms in organizations, that it's time to rethink that. And later I will go through an alternative approach. Since 1970, in order to overcome some of the problems in organizations, over 50% have adopted or used predominantly the matrix design of organizations. And when they set up these designs, the line management is predominantly based on experts. You have functional experts, marketing expert, research expert, finance expert, and so on. And the project management side links in to those experts to gain resources, typically people, when they need them from these experts. And yet it's not changing the organization itself, because it's still a hierarchical bureaucracy. It's just moved it into a slightly different shape. And it's increased the numbers of management, because we now have program management up here. And of course we have the project management, and we have the experts here. And the theory goes that if we get the role of these people in the project side very clearly defined, and the expert's role very clearly defined in terms of their responsibility for the people, then it works. And that may well be the case in theory. There's anyone who knows that this business of the legitimate power with the resource and expert, it works until something happens. And as soon as we get under operational pressure, and we have more work than we can really cope with, or a project is slower than we expected and another one's catching up, we start to get conflicts now between where the resources will work and who will decide where they work. And so we haven't actually solved the problem. In many ways, for the individuals concerned, we've even increased the problem from their point of view. They are now in a dilemma in who is my boss at any one time. So let's just go back to performance management for a second and have a look from the power point of view, how these typically work. So we start off on the left-hand side with our legitimate resource and expert power. We are creating our strategic objectives with our business metrics, at the same time our operational metrics down here. The performance management system takes from the business metrics and the process controls, and together with reward power and coercive power, we ensure our compliance. And so we're using legitimate resource and expert power in setting up the metrics and the objectives, and we're using reward and coercive power to encourage, in quotes, the people to perform in the way that we want them to do. This lacks flexibility. It tends to be very long-winded in terms of being set up, and is not really able to react to the demands of today, even if it was able to when it was first introduced. What I want to do is come back to this positional power and personal power and look at it slightly differently. If we take the referent power, information power, and connection power, we bring those together, we start to look at what is known as the informal organization. Some people call it the shadow organization because it's sort of behind the organization in a shadow. It's not seen, it's not overt. And it's this organization that we use in order to make things happen. I won't go into the way it works because I'm sure everyone is well aware of the informal organization. But there's some elements of this that I think are important for us to understand. If we look at the expert power, this sits between positional power and personal power. Because we're increasingly using experts now in positions such as in the matrix and other forms of organization design. And so the question is, do I want that person in my informal organization or not? And so we then, as individuals, look at the referent power of that person. And if it's someone we can do business with, or we believe that that person will work with us and not criticize us or even stop us, then we welcome that person into the informal organization. And so we have these strong components of an informal organization. And when we come into the world of the informal organization, we have what Ross and I are now discussing in the type of approaches that they work. We have many different informal networks. And if we have a particular task that we want to do, we then work in an effectuation approach. We go to the resources, those are the people we know, and we form a relationship with them in order, in our informal way, to get things done. And that may be something simple like an urgent meeting with a very important customer. If we stick to the formal rules, by the time we got all the different authorities, used the appropriate ways of buying the tickets for the flights and so on, then we may have missed the opportunity. Whereas through the informal network, we just get it done and we get those tickets and we go. And we do this through what we are now calling our coalition power. Instead of just seeing the informal network as a way of getting things done, the more I look at it and the more I work with clients, I see this as an important new form of coalition power. It's by forming these different coalitions, we have the power to do things. And in society, we've known this in politics and other things for generations. It's just in organizations, I'm not sure that we have capitalized on this formation of coalition power enough. And it doesn't just apply within the organization. If we think in society outside now with other businesses, we're now creating ecosystems of organizations who are working together in formal networks. And by bringing those organizations together, we are forming a coalition of power with them as a competitive advantage against our other competitors in the market. For example, the circular economy, I think, is really underestimated still by many organizations. But if we take this as an external network of companies, such as the sourcing of materials, the design of the packaging, the design of the instruments that we use to produce things, to how we dispose, the companies that deal with disposal. And by bringing that network together, we can change the way the materials are delivered, the way our machines are developed, so that we are able to maximize the use of our resources. And so this network, which is a formal network, is now part of our coalition of power. If we use an example today, which I think is really relevant, and that is the e-mobility and the powering of vehicles with batteries. the OEMs who build these cars are desperate to find ways through the circular economy networks to ensure that we get reuse, we get second life, and all the other aspects of the batteries, which at the moment are extremely difficult to manage or even achieve. And the customers of the OEMs, that's you and I, who buy these vehicles, are increasingly interested in, is this vehicle's batteries part of second life and renewal? And so this coalition of different networks is really, really important when we're looking at the move and change of power in organizations. So our challenge really is to capitalize on our understanding of the way power is being used in organizations. Now, unfortunately, many managers assume that restructuring or re-engineering an organization will be accompanied simultaneously or by virtual automatic changes in behavior. And it's as if you rub this wonderful lamp and the genie pops out and makes all this money because everyone's behaving in the same way. And of course, we need that behavioral change because it's essential if we're going to be successful. And yet we all know it seldom happens as it's intended or wished for. And what might be the cause of that? You see, I'm going to argue that organizational power and control has many other forms than the ones I've just discussed. And it's important for us to understand them, because if we don't understand it, we're going to be chasing unicorns. We're really not going to be able to understand the impact of what we're doing and what the organization outcome will be unless we really get to grips with how does all this different type of power operate within organizations, and what's the implication for us of just not identifying one of them within the context of what we're doing. So I'm going to move to processes of organization and management, which may seem a strange thing when I'm talking about power and control. And yet processes are an organizational control mechanism. I think many people forget this. They get so used to going through different processes and designing processes for specific outcomes, most of which are linear processes. And I think they tend to forget that these are actually control mechanisms, and they're a sort of a hidden form of power because they're not recognized in this context. And if we look at an organization, functional, hierarchical, the work is compartmentalized and fragmented. And so we have isolated departments, poor coordination, limited lateral communication, and many other difficulties with such an approach to an organizational structure. And so it comes as no surprise that at some stage it was necessary to bring in processes, and they're crucial for linking all of these different parts of the organization. So it's not saying we shouldn't have processes. It's making sense of what processes in organization should be for and what they mean to the organization as a whole. So I'm just going to spend a few minutes looking into the organizational processes. And the more we look at processes, the more we can see them as a sort of a powerful lens to understand what's going on. So we have the work processes, basically needed to integrate, but very few people see management in the concept of a process. And if we do, we will see seemingly unrelated activities that are very important for us to understand. Now, the good thing is, and this goes back to Alex's presentation yesterday on the academic rigor of what we do in change, there's certainly a lot of research and academic rigor in process theories, that's for sure. How much of it is relevant to what we're doing and how we use it is a different question, but there's certainly an amount of academic rigor. And so process theories tend to go into certain areas. They go into the individual tasks or activities. They're looking at the individual trees. Or they're looking at the forest, the organization as a whole. But what is happening is that organizational process theories seldom explicitly combine the two. And I'm specifically talking about organizational process theories. Now, since I think about 2007, as the IT world has really increased in its impact on organizations, there are certain elements that one could argue have moved from this either or approach. So we have computer-supported cooperative work, which is tending to bring things together a bit more. We have the aspect-oriented paradigm, which again is another movement in the right direction. And with modularity and things like this, we can start to look at things differently in process terms. But these are computerized programs. They're based on trying to find the right algorithms, and they're increasingly needed because of the distribution of power in organizations and the way they work. And so the IT actually is probably further ahead than the traditional approach to process development. And so we're going to look at what the process side is its impact and what it means for organizations. So managerial behavior, for example, most studies provide the straightforward descriptions, time allocation, roles, activity streams, things like this. And yet most of it has highlighted the fragmented quality of managers' jobs rather than their coherence, which is an interesting thing. I'm not sure what's caused it to go that way, but certainly the more I look at the prior research, the more it seems that way. And yet if we look at a manager's behavior, and we have these four examples of what might seem to most people, oh, well, Reg, this is normal business. I'm always getting too many phone calls. God, I can't remember the last time I sat down, I had a break and someone didn't bother me. And I can't even walk down the corridor to go to the toilet without being stopped about something. And my diary just can't cope with any more unscheduled meetings. But that's management. What is it? If we look at them as individual items, we could argue, yeah, that's your day. That's what manager is all about. But if we look at it through a process lens, then we might start to see some links between these activities, and they unfold into a sequence. And then we link that to a process. And well, maybe these telephone calls and corridor conversations are part of the iterative process of decision making because you haven't got the data that you need in order to make a decision. And the process doesn't cater for the data that you need. And if you go further back to maybe a customer where it's a complaint or some system's not working, then the process doesn't actually collect the data that the manager will need further down the system in a parallel process of making decisions, whether it's a patch, whether it's a workaround, or whether it goes into the next generation of updates. It's not in the system because it's a management thing. And so by looking at these individual points through the lens of a process, we start to get a very different picture about what management is all about. If we look at the organizational process side, we have three main approaches. The work processes, which are the engineering side, work measurement. This is about getting things done. This is about tasks. Then we have the behavioral process. And these, I think there's a lot of confusion around these, which I'll show in a minute, but they've got their roots in organizational theory, group dynamics, and it's about ingrained behavior patterns and things like this. And then we have change processes, which have their roots in so many areas: strategic management, organization theory, social psychology, business history, and so on. It seems to come from a whole world of different areas. And so if we look at work processes and the operational process, these are designed so that we actually deliver goods and services to our external customers for their consumption. And we have administrative processes. Now, these aren't necessary for the customers, external customers, but they're needed to support the internal groups in their work processes. And so it's important that we look at both of these processes when we're looking at how things evolve in the organization. Very often, we just focus on the work process. When we come into behavioral processes, I find it fascinating because the behavior is from generalization. We go from observations of everyday work, and the important thing is that what we're looking at has no independent existence apart from the work process in which they appear. Now, this makes it very, very important, but very difficult to identify. And many people think it in terms of organizational culture, and those who know me, I avoid the term culture in organizational context that was stolen from the sort of ethnographic world. I prefer to use the term organizational behavior because I think it's more encompassing. But there is a very big difference here, because the traditional view of organizational culture is more based on sort of values and beliefs, whereas what we're talking about in behavioral processes, it's the cognitive and interpersonal aspects of work, which aren't picked up typically in traditional cultural views. And this is really an important difference in behavioral processes. And we have a tremendous amount of research in behavioral processes, in particular 3 areas: decision-making, communication, and organizational learning processes. And as I'll show in a moment, these 3 have a direct impact on the control of organizations, and yet they're very often seen as separate entities. If we take decision-making, and this is probably the most studied of all of them, then it's a process that's a distributed activity extending over time and involving a number of people. And yet when you talk to managers and you look at the research about others who've talked to managers, young managers or autocratic managers, they say, well, I make the decisions, Reg. It's my job to make decisions. They should never get involved. And yet the manager's role in decision-making is the orchestration and leading this dispersed activity of data and understanding in order to help make that decision. But they seldom see it that way. And the other part about decision-making is it's a very rich process. Many interlinked activities, reciprocal impacts, and multi-organizational levels. I do a lot of work with engineers, and they live in this linear Newtonian world, which I love, and it's important that they are there. They expect me to come up with a magic formula of A plus C divided by whatever equals X, the decision. And I just smile and say, oh, if only it was that simple. But there are some decisions that we can have in a linear flow, but they're very limited. For example, when I was 19, I went to my bank manager, and in those days you would dress up very smartly, go to the local bank because the manager made the decisions. I wanted a loan to buy a car. And he asked me lots of questions and was very polite. And at the end of it, he smiled as he said, no, you cannot have a loan. And he said, but please do come back to me when you earn a man's wage. And that sort of stuck with me. And yet, if I said that to a 19-year-old today, they would just go online, fill in a few things on a form, and within seconds would get a decision, yes or no, for a loan, which is okay because the algorithm is set and the parameters are there. But the outliers, the exceptions aren't there. They're missing. And so so many things in decision making rely on those outliers, and that's very, very difficult for any system to take account of currently. And decision making is a lengthy, complex, and slow to change process. Once people identify a way of making decisions, then they tend to stick with it. And of course, that means it suffers from the predictable bias and the filters that we have. And the important point here, though, is the administrative, structural, and strategic context is critical in decision making. More of that later. So if we summarize the decision making process, it could be slow or fast, generate few or many alternatives, rely primarily on operating or financial data, engage few or many organizational levels, involve consensual or hierarchical resolution of conflicts, and be tolerant of or closed to divergent opinions. In other words, everything affects the decision. There is no simple way. But what we do know is organizations do everything they can to ensure they control who makes the decisions. It is one of the key elements of organizational control. If we look at communication, which is often seen as a very simple process, but it relies on the relationships and the quality and richness of the communication and the information processing activities. How do we share our data? How do we develop the agenda? How do we agree goals? And how do we deal with conflicts? Are all part of this communication process. The interesting thing is when you look at the research on communication, the patterns within organizations are very predictable because they become embedded in everyday working life, and they're not always apparent to the people who are using them. And they often see this as a simple process of just transfer of information from one person to another. And yet it's anything but simple. It's highly variable and complex. And we have all sorts of, as those of you know about communication, the facts, feelings, perceptions, innuendos, and all the things that go into these simple messages. And these are often overlooked when we start to think about bringing about change, because communication falls into two categories. We've got those who are needed for the task management and the work to be accomplished. But we have those for building the group and maintaining its relationship. And the more I look at the way organizational change processes go and the way organizations are structured, this second part often gets lost. The focus tends to be on getting things done and making the changes happen. And so we have to make sure that the nature and direction and the quality flows in the way that we want them to. And the key here, again, in terms of power and control, is the relationships between the group members, their stances towards one another, and the tenor and tone of the group work are critical in the communication process. So if we're sitting in silos and we're being measured on our performance in our marketing role or in our engineering role, our research or development role, and the hierarchy are fighting for their resources and their budgets, so our loyalty is within our functional group, then communication across those is very hard because the relationships aren't there. So if we really designing our organization for communication, we have to really understand that this relationship is absolutely crucial. People might say, well, what's organizational learning got to do with this power and control? And the way we learn is really embedded in the organization. just as much as the decision making and the communication processes are. And it's about shared perspectives of the development and the acquisition of knowledge. And this shared perspective is very, very important, because the basic assumptions of how we behave as an organization actually leads to different learning values and our investment in the process of learning as an organization. And if we're a highly competitive intercompetitiveness within the organization, then the values are going to be very, very different to one if we're collaborative, working together and understanding each other. And of course, if we are creating different management climates within the organization, then so it will impact on our learning. Whereas some managers will say, we don't have time to reflect after this project, we've got pressure to get the next one done, then we lose that opportunity. If we've got another one who says, well, we're too big as an organization, we can't get the information to others, let's just forget about that, just learn for ourselves, and so forth. We have all sorts of different views on what learning should be and how it can be in an organization. And each approach has different tools, systems and behaviors associated with that particular learning approach. And so the underlying processes differ accordingly. I always remember that many, many years ago when British standards were first being formed and I was given the task of BS 5750, it's deeply ingrained within my brain, a number I'll never forget. And I had to design this process of this standard. And the great day came of judgment when this expert would come along and say whether it would be accredited or not. And he looked and read, and then he came to me and he said, what's this picture doing here? I said, but what do you mean? What's it doing here? I said, it's a flow chart that helps people see through the standard, and they can then deep dive wherever. We don't have pictures in official documents, young man. When you have made and written this properly, I will come back and review it. He wasn't able to understand that people were learning and looking at things differently. And of course, today we would laugh at that approach, but that was very much the approach of the official standards in the UK at the time. And so whenever we're looking at how we learn, remember that some people may not want us to learn because it's their way of controlling what they do in the way that they do it. So let's just sort of summarize the behavioral processes. The activity is distributed throughout the organization. It unfolds over time. It involves people in diverse departments and positions and rests on a few critical sub-processes or routines. It's an organizational process rather than an individual process. And as such, we can start to classify it into different modes and styles. And this is very, very important that it's seen as an organizational process. Because when we bring these together, all three, decision-making, communication, and organizational learning, share many of the same characteristics. And when we bring them together, they're very complementary and synergistic. Yet we seldom do this in my experience, and when I look at the research, very much it's seldom brought together. And by bringing them together, they interact in predictable ways, and they produce clusters of characteristics that are mutually reinforcing. And so often people have said to me, well, what's your communication process for the change? And I said, well, what is your normal way of communication in your organization? What stops us using that? What is the reason for some other system? And how does that link with your other processes? It's very important to bring these together. The last process I want to look at is the change process. And the processes really describe how groups and individuals in the organizations adapt, develop, and grow. They're explicitly dynamic, and importantly, they're intertemporal. But unlike the work and behavioral processes, what we're trying to do in change is catch reality in flight, because it's a living, breathing thing. And if we're too early or too late, then we've missed the boat. So it's about getting things at the right time. So we've got to really catch the reality. And most studies have focused on 4 areas: creation, growth, transformation, and decline. Each of these is a critical stage in individual or organizational life cycle. And over time, the life cycle, this life cycle of 4 stages, has become the organizing framework of the field of change. And in that framework, we have choices which are typically sitting somewhere between the Darwinian theory approach of change and the newer sort of punctuated equilibrium framework. And it's interesting because there's a great debate over this Darwinian approach or this episodic approach. And you'd think in today's world, where every organization that I've ever gone to and things that I read is change is just, it never stops. It's a continuing process. It's accelerating all the time. You would think then that this Darwinian approach of continual change would be where the focus is. And yet every study and commentary says the opposite and says it's still the episodic approach to change. And this alternative sort of periods of stability and revolutionary change. And Ross and I we said, oh, Earth is the reason for this. It doesn't make sense. This episodic change just doesn't make sense in the current condition. And so we discussed it quite a lot. And this is just one of our thoughts. So if we've got an organization, I think most of you will probably agree that the membership of the organization are always raising issues and concerns with senior management. They're always saying about the software that's out of date, or actually the competitors are thinking about a new product. I think we should start looking at ours and do some modification, and many, many other things that they would like to change. And yet nothing happens because the management with the traditional approach are much too busy involved in the day-to-day work. Because the downside of modern IT is the senior managers have such good information now that they think they understand what's happening at the work level, and think being the operative word. And at the same time, because of this sort of fingers in approach by management, the workforce says, well, actually, it's now easy using this technology to escalate the decision up the line and let them make the decision. And so we have this sort of to and fro using different modern systems of communication and information flows, where management are today much, much too involved in the day-to-day work. And until it gets to a point where there's so much pressure for change that they say, well, hang on, we've got to do something. And so we get into this induced episodic change. So the pressure from the workforce starts to have something changed. May not necessarily be all the things they've asked for, or it may be something very, very different, but at least something begins to happen. And so we're sort of looking around that area to say, well, is that true? Is that really what's causing this seemingly strange approach of hanging on to episodic change? But whether the change is autonomous or induced, then we have these 2 very different approaches. And the autonomous processes occur naturally, whereas induced processes must be created. Interestingly, the autonomous processes have a life of their own because some of it is preordained and inevitable. For example, an entrepreneur, we know that at some stage it will become some form of bureaucratic organization as it grows. We know this is going to happen. History has shown us time and time and time again, with very few exceptions. And yet it still happens. And so it's important for managers to be attentive. Where is this going? Where are we? And are we at the right point in our development in this autonomous process? Very seldom do I either read or hear about people who have said, stop, we're going towards a bureaucracy. I don't want to do that. And there are exceptions. Some of the companies that Ross and I have looked at, there were deliberate decisions by entrepreneurs not to go down that road, but they were deliberate decisions. It wasn't the traditional autonomous process. The induced processes, of course, they don't occur naturally, and an all planned change is an induced process. And they're in three basic stages. The first is, what is the current state? Let's assess it. And what is the energy applied to dislodge the accepted patterns? The second one is a flux. The old ways are partially suspended and new approaches are tested and developed. And a third one, of course, is consolidation, and hopefully new attitudes and behaviors become institutionalized and widely adopted. And there is a multitude of models and processes used to bring about induced change. And they're predominantly linear. So we sort of start to come towards the end now, a summary of the processes of organizational management, and we can define them and we can say what categories they're in and examples of them. But the important point here for us today is the role of processes, and they are a major partner in controlling organizations, work processes. They accomplish the work of the organization. They're there to make sure it's done. The behavioral processes, they shape the way things are done. And the change processes alter the character and identity of the organization in the way things are done. They are all part of controlling organizations. And so when we're moving from organizations designed for control to organizations designed for work, the position power, personal power, process power, and coalition power are critical factors in our organizational design and change. So the last couple of slides now, when we're looking at this futocracy type organization, Ross and I have said, well, what is the futocratic approach to performance management? And first of all, we wanted to get rid of performance management and said, well, let's call it organization alignment, as opposed to the performance management, which is about compliance. Alignment, we're trying to get about collaboration. And so we start off with the statement of purpose, and we link into the three key powers of legitimate power, resource power, and reward power. And from these, we develop the business objectives and the operational metrics, which of course, they are movable feasts depending on the situations. And so there is a strong relationship between the two. And then we go down the route of distributed authority and decision-making. This is where we break away now from the traditional approach. Now, if we're doing this, we need some form of, it is a form of control, but certainly some form of insurance that things are going to be what we want them to be at the end in terms of what we're in business for. So we set up principles, guidelines, and where necessary, processes. And the processes tend to be very short, simple processes for common repetitive decision making. So that it, or for some other legal reason why it must be in one particular way. And so these are pushed out to the personal power and the distributed authority people, so that they have some clear guidelines and ways of helping them focus where their decisions are. But at the end of the day, these principles and guidelines are very wide. They have a lot of flexibility. And through these, we start to work in this collaborative network of network groups. So we're into networks of groups and teams here. And this network has this authority and personal power to work to the outcomes that they have to deliver. And this coalition of power is very important here also, because instead of being in the dark side, the shadow of the organization, these informal networks we now bring to the surface. Let's use the resources as we know them, the relationships as we understand them, because this is about true collaboration across the whole organization. And let's develop this coalition power. And as I mentioned before, there are formal external networks which can also be part of this coalition of power. So we're starting now to build up quite a base that enables us to use resources in different ways, to have the authority to make decisions. When we find that things are changing in the landscape that we're working, either internally or externally, because we're collaborating, we're able then to adjust the way the membership of the collaboration work. So the formal processes that were designed by experts up till today, where we wait for grey or clear smoke to say whether they've finished designing the new processes, which take weeks, months, sometimes years, we do away with that because we can change the way we work in real time through the collaboration. By doing this, we start now to get commitment, because people now are coming to be able to do what they want to do. Increasingly, we have generations coming into work who they want to make a difference. They want to be part of that, and they want to own and value what they do. And this is their opportunity. And so this is their opportunity to not only commit, but to engage, which then leads to a collaborative outcome, which is crucial for the future. It's not about sales, winning sales, and R&D finding a good product. It's working together to get collaborative outcomes for the business. And of course, we have this sort of control loop, if you want to use the term, where we're always measuring what we're doing with the operational metrics so that we can reinforce and or change what we're doing and improve. And by doing this, we start to align work, behavior, and change. And so if we're going to align work, behavior, and change in such a way where we're distributing the power and the control systems in a way that supports and actually requires collaboration, then it's not fair to call this a futocratic approach, because it's not only a futocratic organization that can do this. I will argue that it's an alternative approach to organizational alignment by understanding the power and control systems of all the different processes and the types of power, that you can even introduce this into a traditional hierarchical organization. It would not be easy, and there would be many, many failures, but you could do it. I'm suggesting that you don't try to do that. What I'm suggesting is that if we understand the relationships between the organizational power and control mechanisms, then we can get an improved organizational design and an engaged workforce. And so finally, if we go down the route of futocracy, then the organizations are designed for work, but they're still under control. Thank you for your patience and staying power.
Let's go ahead and open it up for questions now. Any comments?
Sure, I'll make a comment. Reg, that was awesome. Thank you for that.
Thank
It
you.
really resonates with me and reinforces some of the stuff that I've been doing. I guess if I had a choice of words, I probably wouldn't use the word alignment, but I'd be going more into a complex word, which we're using called coherence, where coherence just makes sense to the individual. Where alignment, maybe it carries a stigma that I'm being forced, maybe instead of being volunteer, being voluntary to align to something like get with the program. So again, it's a choice of words, and that's so I'm using coherence.
Yeah, I mean, this whole issue, I think, we've discussed this in the past, and Ross and I are always talking about it. We need new words.
We do.
We've run out of the old words, have such a history and a prejudice based on that history, depending what you come from, that we need some new words. And that's one of the challenges, I think, not just what Ross and I are having with what we're doing here, but what you're doing and what John does with his work and so on. This whole idea of looking for new words is so important.
Yeah, totally agree. I think when you change a language, then the paradigms will change.
Absolutely.
So I think what our mind wants to do is look at it into word code and try to fit it in the old paradigms in our head and try to categorize things, where as opposed to letting it go and looking at something just totally brand new.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. This is why I struggle with the word culture, as I often say, because it's got so many inbuilt prejudices and distortions within it that I get lost amongst what they mean.
And that's the imperfection of particularly the English language, isn't it? We just don't have enough words to describe what we want to say.
That's
I wanted to throw open a question, which is really to try and understand. I mean, I remember years and years ago, in perhaps the earlier days of my consultancy work, the promise was that organizations would move towards self-directed teams, self-managed teams. And we do away with supervisors and team leaders and managers, because teams would manage themselves and hold each other to account.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem to have really materialized, and I wonder if you have any thoughts on why that might be the case, because this hierarchical infrastructure, which I tend to think very much of a policing structure fundamentally. So it's interesting that you started with your story about the formation of the police, but it is really sort of designed to police.
Absolutely. It's like the army. Sticking. It's 1, 2, and 20, and that's the paradigm they've stuck for centuries. I think there are several things here, Tim. One is about timing, because many things that Ross and I have uncovered with our really research going way back is we're repeating so many things of the past as new things today. And I always think of the Volvo experiments of the autonomous self-team working and all this sort of stuff, which from memory was sort of mid-70s, which was an absolute failure. And when we look at the reasons for why it might have failed, one is it's about, is it the right time? And how do we decide whether it's the right time? One of those is, do we have the support systems that are necessary to move from what is a very effective method of running an organization, if it was a requisite organization and we didn't have all the personality traits that cause the problems in bureaucracies, we can't ignore that they can be very, very efficient. So I think today we have technology that enables us to feel more comfortable in understanding what others are doing and being able to have this collaborative mechanism that wasn't able in the past. It's like the police example I gave. We had no telephones then that you could carry around with you. If you wanted to contact a police officer on the streets, you had to flash a light on a box and hope that that person saw it, and all those sorts of things. So we didn't have the communication. You didn't have the transport. And so we didn't have the infrastructure. And I think the infrastructure we are now getting. I'm not sure we've got it as we need it, but certainly we're now getting it. And then we have the situation, I think, that the agile world is, if we look at Scrum Masters. If you ask a Scrum Master, what's your biggest nightmare on day-to-day working? They say, management can't let go and won't let me do my job. And so we now have the people side, and this is education. And so I hope will, over the next 5 years or so, have this new generation coming up to the C-suites who understand technology, they understand people dynamics, and don't come from the traditional banking world that many of these CEOs come from the legal world, and they come more from the engineering world and the people world. And if we can bring those things together, I think it's more likely to happen.
Thank you. I mean, a key word that stands out for me is trust. That if you can engender trust throughout the organization, then people are prepared to hang back, and they don't need to exert such control because they just know it's going to happen. It's going to happen without them.
Yes, I agree. And trust was the cause of the control systems, or lack of it, in the early days. They didn't trust the workers to do the job, with some cause for that as well. If you look at the history of what workers were doing, sometimes there was a lot of reason for it, but we've gone from one extreme to the other. I mean, Ross, what do you think on that?
I think in addition to trust, there's also the ability or willingness to be vulnerable to and admit that you don't know everything. There's almost a self-fulfilling problem when people are promoted. They're expected to know everything, and they have a fear of not showing their true understanding of the problem. So they go with an outward appearance of confidence while inwardly being very fearful. And you get some weird dynamics from that alone on wanting to control out of fear of showing that you're not in control.
Yeah. And I think there's another dynamic that I think, Tim, probably makes it even more important today. And that is the young people today are not, I'm a baby boomer. So I did what I was told and was grateful for having a job. And if I had a pension at the end, I was even more pleased. That was the world that I went into. And people needed employment. The kids today have so many options for alternative ways of generating money that they now go to organizations not to be interviewed for a job, but to interview the organization as to whether they are actually suitable for me to come to them. And I think this is the driver. I'll give you a very quick example. It's very common in the banking world for them to get the cream of universities to join them into their sort of senior management schemes. And in Austria, 3 years ago, one of the top banks had 7 or 8 of these highly intelligent individuals in front of them as part of the induction of coming into their organization for future senior positions. And one of the new guys turned around and said, "Excuse me, but where's my iPhone? Where's my iPad? And when is the chairman of the bank going to come and talk to us?" So the HR person, typically, who was running the induction, said, "Well, we don't give you iPhones. We only give those to senior people. iPads, only the board have. And you may see the chairman of the bank at some stage in your career." So the person said, "Well, thank you. That's really important information for me." Got up and said, "I will now go for an employer who values me." And 4 of them got up and walked out. When they did it last year, this chairman was there to welcome them. All the equipment they needed was there, and it was a totally different conversation. And I think this is also one of the changing factors that can help bring about this change.
I think there's also some other pressures that are coming to the forefront right now from COVID and the reaction to COVID and how work has changed because of the work at home, the different ways of working, different ways of communicating. People are starting to rethink not only their relationship with work, but the relationship of work in their life. And that's putting some pressure on the turnover rate that right now most organizations haven't really come to deal with other than through traditional ways, but that may come to a much bigger force of how organizations do change and how rapidly they understand the need to change. Other questions or comments?
Okay, anybody else? Then one of your earlier slides that you showed, Reg, shows shareholder value. Good old SVA.
Yeah.
And we know about that when it was first introduced, and people like Jack Welch just wrote it. Then, of course, after in his retirement, Jack Welch says that was probably one of the most dumbest ideas I ever introduced.
Absolutely.
Where does SVA in your research, both you and Ross, where does it sit? Does it still dominate, or is things like the circular economy, are these things coming to the forefront?
I think it's right at the cusp of change.
Yeah.
Right at the cusp, because if you look now, shareholders are rebelling against what the senior people in organizations are being paid. And this is beginning now of shareholders starting to take their responsibilities in recognizing that businesses to survive today is more than just paying a very senior CEO to bring high returns. It's about what they do as an organization in order to get the right people in, how that links to the world of the green economy and all those sorts of things, and which includes the circular economy. And the stuff I'm reading at the moment is they're right at the point. Now, which way it's going to tip, time will see, but I actually think it's going to tip against shareholder value. And some companies now are actually bringing young people into the shareholder team to help them learn a new way, which is quite an interesting concept. And at the same time, these young people are learning how to be shareholders in a new world.
Right. And I see some companies are buying back their shares so they aren't subject to the market forces.
Yeah.
There as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you think about it, you may remember last year I did the history of organizations, and we sort of go through these peaks and troughs of conglomerates and then breakups, either through legislation or through economic chaos. And I think we're now at the peak, ready to come down into the next trough, because as a society, we wax and wane. And I think as a society, we're waning at the moment. We're lost in what society means. And I think it's the same with business. They've peaked in all this shareholder stuff, and they're now looking for where's the next wave going to take us. And Schumpeter, I think, was very, very right here. Yeah. It's just that the technical drivers of the past that have caused these waves, we've been waiting for that. But at the moment, we have too few people with too much of the wealth stopping it. Yeah. And that also needs to be broken.
Maybe it takes a generational change where we boomers let things go, right? And let the next generation alphas take over.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I can recommend an amazing book, if you've not already read it, by David Attenborough. Some of you may know who he is, but in the UK, he's environmentalist. He is a phenomenon. He's about 95 or something, and he's still going strong, making natural history programs and a big campaigner for climate change. But he's recently, the last couple of years, produced an amazing book. And one of the things he talks about in that book is that the relentless pursuit of growth is completely unsustainable.
Yeah.
And the balance needs to shift now. So it's less about growth. It's more about, sustainability and putting back and rebuilding. And when an organization shifts its policy towards taking a more environmentally responsible approach and makes its decisions based on, is this sustainable? Is this sustainable at the human level for our employees? Can we keep expecting more and more of our people? Instances of burnout throughout the last couple of years have rocketed, certainly in the UK and possibly across the world. Some of our working practices are not sustainable. Our economic practices are not sustainable. And I think that is going to, and you talk about a new generation, I think they get it. And hopefully they'll bail us out, because we haven't really left them with a great legacy at this point in time.
I do a survey with my new incoming students every year. And if we go back a few years, it was all about I need, I want, I must, designer this and designer that. And it was all about me as an individual. I was really shocked in the cohort that came in 2021. They have gone totally in a totally different direction. And the change was so quick in that it's about shared ownership. They do not want possessions, designer stuff they're not interested in. If it's comfortable, functional and fits, that's it. The whole issue about transport and that it's not even a discussion for them. They never want to own cars. They say, why do I want to own a car? I can get transport anywhere very cheaply without all this cost. And so I think what IKEA have started to do, and that is to start to bring in parts so that you can refurbish your last purchases going way back 30 years when they started. You can get parts now to rejuvenate old furniture and stuff. They're starting to think differently as well. And I think the shortage of resources and the current transportation issues that we have worldwide have reinforced this, because their existing business is non-sustainable. So they have to change. And I think they're not alone in this, really not alone. And this fashion world, where you get jeans that are designed for wear, and then you purposely make holes in them and destroy them for fashion so they won't wear. It's obscene, quite frankly. We can't sustain this. The resources aren't there. So I think they're going to push us for change on these.
Yeah. I'm in that same boomer generation where it was drilled into me that, Gary, you haven't made in life into your own house. And that's caused so much pressure where we live on housing prices and everything else. People are running out and mortgaging themselves to the hilt just so they can say, I own something.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that's one of those shifts we have to make, going, it's okay that you don't own any physical assets, particularly where I live, Vancouver. If you get hit by an earthquake, you really don't want to own anything.
Yeah. Let me just go to Misida. You talk about the younger generations, they want this work-life balance. Would you like to comment on that?
A very interesting discussion there. Thank you for pointing out to my comment. Yes, I come from a very different part of the world where most of you are. I'm in Oman. It's in the Middle East. It's a neighboring country to Dubai. Mm-hmm. I'm an assistant professor as well. So I've been teaching for almost 20 years now. Yeah. And like what you said, Craig, you said you've noticed a change in the students, and I have noticed that change as well. And what I wrote here is something that I have felt and I hear students talk about. It's very easy for them to say no to job opportunities that come across, simply because they don't fit with their lifestyle. They have very different priorities from the priorities that our parents had and priorities that I myself have. And I believe that looking at the numbers of employees from these two generations, Generation Y and Z, joining workplaces, I think change is inevitable for these organizations. They are replacing large numbers of yeah, older people leaving organizations. Generation X are there in top managerial positions, and some of them really share a lot of characteristics with Generation Y. So leadership styles are changing. I can see them changing in our part of the world, and relationships are still very important. Education is also changing the way these younger generations think, and geographical distance really does not matter now. When I was a student, I remember it was very unusual to hear someone say, "I have friends from other continents." But now, my 10-year-old son, I hear him speak to people online, "Where is your friend from?" "Oh, they're from this part of the world, that part of the world." "Mom, it doesn't matter. They're my friends. It doesn't matter where they're from. It doesn't matter what time it is."
They're global citizens.
Exactly. They're very different. And that's why I thought to share that. And when we tend to say that they're disloyal, they don't have the loyalty, they don't have any expectations to stay for 20 years in one organization like myself.
Yeah.
Yes. So yeah, that's why I wrote that. And thank you for pointing out.
Oh, thank you for raising it.
Where do I teach? I teach in Sultan Qaboos University.
Ah, right.
Okay.
It's a part of the world I've not been to. I've been to and worked in over 40 countries, but your part of the world has eluded me up till now. So maybe post-COVID, I can start to think of moving to that part of the world.
Yeah, I asked that question because I've traveled to Muscat, Oman a number of times now to teach at one of the colleges there, and have really loved the experience. Not only in the classroom, but also traveling the area.
Well, it will be an honor to have you back, maybe this time in Sultan Qaboos University as a visiting lecturer, maybe.
we could talk.
Yes.
One of my most interesting experiences there was that since I was teaching in the classroom, they held a university-wide session for me to basically make a presentation, and they pretty much left it up to me. So I did the presentation, and it was going really well. Everyone else was, they're really engaged. Everyone was listening, hanging on every word. And I thought I was really doing good. Then we did the break. We took a break, and when it come back, instead of like 100 people in the room, there was 6 in the room. I said, what happened? Where was everybody else? I felt so, out of it. Well, it turned out that the majority were there as English as a second language, and they weren't there to hear my speech at all. They were there to hear me speak, not to hear me speak. It was such a dramatic change, though. I felt I totally missed it, and everybody left.
It's a nice one.
Yeah.
Actually, what you were saying about the new generation actually just sort of triggered something for me. And that is when we talk about engagement of people in organizations, maybe now we're using the wrong word. And this comes back to this horrible discussion about having to invent new words, because what does engagement mean to the youth of today compared with engagement that the social scientists and the researchers are looking at in terms of engagement in organizations? And I think maybe we're drifting apart in what it really means. And there is a new type of definition for engagement needed to make sense of the motivation and engagement of young people.
Yeah, well, just think of the communication amongst the family and what the pandemic has done. I know for our family, it's probably brought us closer together because we've had to go onto Zoom and do fam jams, as we call it, and everything else. Your story about your 10-year-old son having friends around the world reminds me of a story we had in, when you have a family get together, it's always in the front lobby as you're saying goodbye to each other. It takes about half an hour in the lobby before actually people leave. Well, all the young people are there and they don't even say goodbye. And one time I asked them, why don't you say goodbye? And the answer was, because we never sign off. And you're right. I mean, as soon as they left, my grandson was on Instagram or Facebook talking to his cousin. So they never sign off. So I think it was a real like aha moment for me.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Very true. Very true. I totally agree. We tend to think because they are so attached to these devices and, you know, social media, we hear many parents saying these kids lack social skills, but actually they are practicing a lot of their social skills more than us. Yeah.
It's like my nephew. I mean, he actually lives and works in Canada. And he always says, look, Uncle, don't worry about us. He says, when you're long dead and gone, we'll still be communicating and enjoying life. And of course, it's so true. So true. Okay, any other questions or comments anyone would like to make?
Well, I appreciate everyone's time. Really good discussion. So far, the engagement has been good here as well as in the other presentations that we've observed, and really appreciate everyone getting involved with really rethinking organizations, rethinking change, and just doing a lot of reflection that so often in today's hectic world is overlooked. So I appreciate your time, your engagement. Any other closing comments, Reg?
No, just thanks everyone for joining us. And I look forward to discussions on the network in terms of how we can look at this whole power and control in future organizations. So thanks a lot for coming. And I look forward to the rest of the presentations this evening. So I've got time for a quick snack before I have to get back at 6 o'clock. And also, Gary, I'll see if I can find time to put a case on tomorrow, but I can't guarantee it, but I'll try.
That's good. Okay. And you're on tomorrow as well, Ross, right? Really?
Yes, I am. I'm going to be talking about alignment, mainly because so often we don't think about what alignment is. So it's more of not so much of here what it is as here's my thinking on it and have an open discussion on it. Okay, great.
Awesome.
Thanks everyone. See you around the network or anywhere around the world as we all cross paths. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot. Cheers.